Okay, good evening, everyone here at the NIKI and those joining us online. Welcome, welcome. My name is Michael Wakkenstein and I'm the director, and it is a huge pleasure for me to introduce this evening's speaker to you. That is Geronimus. Dennis Geronimus is a professor of Italian Renaissance art at New York University, where as of this fall he is marking his 25th year of service. Compliment. He has recently served 3 times as chair of the Department of Art History, and on 2 occasions NYU had recognized him with the Golden Dutton Award for Excellence in Teaching. His research interests include artistic cross-currents between Italy and Northern Europe, as well as between Africa and the Mediterranean. Also artist engagement with the natural world, mythological narrative, and other forms of storytelling, and pictorial wit and humor. This is the author of Chiaro di Cosimo, Visions Beautiful and Strange, that was published by Yale University Press back in 2006, as well as numerous articles, essays, and reviews in the Berkeley magazine, Art Bulletin, Renaissance Quarterly, Mitteilungen, and other publications. In 2014, together with Gretchen Hirschauer, he co-curated the first ever Piero di Cosimo exhibition, Piero di Cosimo, The Poetry of Painting in Renaissance Florence. And that was at the National Gallery of Art in Washington. This exhibition was selected by the Wall Street Journal as one of the best exhibitions of the year, and it subsequently traveled to a second venue, and it was here in Florence in the Uffizi, 2015. And that was the first ever exhibition partnership between the 2 institutions. In the same year, so 2015, he organized Piero di Cosimo, Painter of Faith and Fable, and that was a 2-day conference that took place here at our institute. And the proceedings, which Dennis edited, were published in 2019 in our own NIKI series, NIKI Studies in Netherlands, Italian Art History. Among its more recent publications, I would like to mention A More Loving and Constant Heart, Vittoria Colonna, Alfonso d'Avalos, Michelangelo, and the Complicated History of Pontormo's Noli Me Tangere. And that appeared in Vittoria Colonna, Poetry, Religion, Art, Impact. And it's a collection of essays that was edited by Virginia Cox and Sharon McHugh and published by Amsterdam University Press in 2022. In 2021, Dennis curated Grey Matters at Nicholas Hall in New York, an exhibition inspired by the rediscovery of Pontormo's Keziah, The Labors of Adam and Eve with Cain and Abel. The expansive exhibition essay he wrote was also published 2 years later. Currently, and he's also scholar in residence here, he is working on a monograph on Pontormo entitled Jacopo da Pontormo, Overcoming Nature. In another exciting development, he's also contributing as guest curator to a 2-venue exhibition devoted to Pontormo, and that is planned to open at the National Gallery of Art in Washington and the National Gallery of London in 2028-29. As I have some patience. Dennis' research projects have been supported by the Met, the Clark Art Institute, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Renaissance Society of America, the Warwick Institute, the Emily Harvey Foundation in Venice, and by the NIKI, by us. Since the late 1990s, he has often stayed with us also for extended periods of time as scholar in residence, during which time he worked on a variety of projects, and the most recent of which led to the 3-day conference titled Hidden in Plain Sight, Black African Lives and Visual Histories in the Early Modern World, which we hosted earlier this year together with NYU Florence. In this evening's talk, Dennis picks up the conversation on the fraught power dynamics of race, gender, and social mobility in the early modern period. Using a diverse range of visual examples, he will show us how the crossings of racial and regional boundaries continue to reshape Renaissance studies and the way we teach its histories today. Then, the floor is yours.
Michael, thank you so much. I feel like I've lived 10 lives after that introduction. Unfortunately, 9 of them I think have been lived here at the NIKI. And I'm ever so grateful. I'm actually becoming, if anything, with time, more and more grateful in this crazy, fraught world that we live in to have a peaceful and welcoming community. It's not really an institute for me. It's very much a community of colleagues and friends like the NIKI. So warm thanks to you and to the rest of the NIKI staff, to Gerjan and Lex, Ilaria, who makes all the books available for us and then somehow puts them away, and also Matthias, who designed the beautiful visuals. In some ways, the talk today, it's not going to be just a purely scholarly talk. It's, as the abstract noted, is aimed, if anything, more at the students in this room and online. And it's both autobiographical as well as objective, I hope. But the direct inspiration for the title of the talk originated with someone in this room who pointed me in the right direction to a public conversation that took place very recently in Antwerp at the end of September, that was recorded and that I listened to with tremendous interest as soon as it happened. And it's a talk by Judith Butler entitled "On Belonging, Rethinking Power, Violence, and Justice." It wasn't really a talk, it was more of a conversation. And it was a conversation about belonging, not belonging, and choosing not to belong. And that is something that also alerted me to, let's see, for some reason, where...
You have to click into it, and then it will let you go to the next slide.
Oh, I see, okay. So as soon as I do that, hopefully, okay. And that, of course, made me think of a number of things. And one of the points that I almost immediately have to bring up here is that today's talk is something of a prologue, but it's also even more so an epilogue to a conference that I had the privilege of organizing here at the NIKI called Hidden in Plain Sight. And one of the interesting comments that was made by Judith Butler during this conversation in late September is that her interlocutor, Sarah Brackey, in her introductory remarks, asked if it is possible to see ourselves in the faces of those who are marginalized or oppressed, forgotten, representing the other. And in her response, Butler was careful to note that in seeing the faces of others, it is also important to recognize difference. And that is also going to be, I think, one of the important themes today. How can one recover lost voices or silenced voices when we, of course, are approaching them at a completely different time, but also with completely different sets of expectations and life experiences and intrinsically our identities, however we might define them. And this is the beautiful flyer that, again, Matthias helped us design for the January conference. And many of the comments that I heard in the Judith Butler conversation, but also in virtually all of the talks that defined this gathering in January, spoke to this both tension and possibility of seeing oneself in the faces of others, but also seeing difference. And the question to me remains, how might we reimagine and give voice to lives that the archives have barely recorded? And it must be said from the outset that in my own work, in my own teaching, in many ways, this is really just the beginning. So there's really going to be nothing definitive about what I'm about to say today. It's really more of an opening up of a conversation or a dialogue. And I think most important guiding principle for me going forward after the conference that brought all of these marvelous voices together in January is that this absolutely has to be a collective effort. And the sense of community at our conference back in January, with colleagues working among and between a multiplicity of fields, working with material that was visual, that was archival, archaeological, even sonic. There was a musicologist who presented a brilliant talk. This is really the way forward. But focusing on art history specifically, what I hope to do today and what I've been hoping to do in my teaching, and the other, I have to say, source of inspiration for tonight's talk, is a pair of seminars I've taught in recent years for the first time during COVID, called Absence and Agency, the representations of lives of Black Africans in early modern Europe. The main motivation is to shift what has been, what was on the margins, to the center of our canon. And so let's see where we travel today. One of the main anchors of today's presentation, today's conversation, invariably is going to be the human body. And I know that Michael was slightly disappointed that I wasn't going to lecture exclusively on Pontormo today, but I will certainly introduce him, and there will be echoes of Pontormo throughout. But I've really been thinking of nothing, and there are other Pontormo scholars here in the audience. I've been thinking about nothing but bodies, distorted bodies, muscular, athletic, dynamic bodies under pressure and in motion, abject bodies, pathetic bodies. In the case of his Garzone sketches after his assistants, absolutely famished, exhausted bodies. But this also ties in, I think, in very relevant ways to what we will discuss in terms of seeing and, again, reorienting from the margins to the center Black bodies and even other geographies. What I'm showing you here, in some ways, is the fruit of my labor so far as a scholar in residence, in that during 2 trips to France, and in this particular case, Germany, this is an image from the Hamburger Kunsthalle, from the drawings cabinet there. It's, I have to say, of all the extraordinary drawings departments we visited, this one is beyond description. We visited either me individually, or moreover, we as a team Pontormo visited, I believe, 11 cities and 16 collections in 18 days over the last month and a half. So if I break into a coughing fit in the middle of this talk, please forgive me, but you'll know why. But these were the objects of our destination. And here you're seeing 2 drawings that are approximately a decade and a half, 2 decades apart. And of course, the bodies represented here could not be more different. And so really, the body becomes the contested terrain. And in this particular case, the battlefield itself. And I'm not going to dwell too long on this, because I also promised Michael that I will gladly, if given an opportunity, present another talk on Pontormo's drawings in particular in the future. But this is really to prepare the field for what's about to come, for quite different bodies that we're about to observe. And I've tried to be as descriptive as possible in most of the labels, the captions that I've added here. But the painting here in the Galleria Palatina is less than a decade after this drawing, which one could orient an entire gallery around for an exhibition, for a fresco that no longer survives, that was begun in 1521-22 outside of the gate of San Frediano here in Florence, but had to be abandoned because of the onset of plague. So if we think that we are living in traumatic times, Pontormo, I think, puts us to shame in some ways. So moving on to the language of the body, or the vocabulary of the body in Jacopo da Pontormo's works, we're about to see quite different bodies, not so much bodies, but the way that these bodies are represented, seen and unseen, in many ways, hidden, but hidden in plain sight. And I think really the focus of today's talk and why I included the phrase hidden in plain sight at its very end, is that so much of what has been hidden in plain sight, in fact, has always been visible. These bodies have always been there. And if we think of what artists did and do, and there are artists in the audience here tonight as well, to me, it's always been to make sense of the world. And that is what we do as historians and art historians as well. So how does one make sense of a painting that is, I think, eminently known to all of you? In the Academia in Venice, the Feast in the House of Levi, that features no fewer than 11 Africans, but most of them are completely obscured, or as the figure that I just showed you, and I hope the mouse works on the screen. Does it? Yeah. The figure that I just showed is in the very extreme left corner, and others are mixed with the house steward at right, with dwarves, and as you might remember from the contemporary accounts of this fresco, even a diner picking his teeth with a fork. They're completely subsidiary, completely incidental, black bodies on the margins in every literal way on the outside, looking in, both in terms of class and station, but also in terms of the way they're positioned within Veronese's composition. And needless to say, the event of the year at the moment is happening at the Palazzo Strozzi and at the Museo di San Marco and San Domenico outside Isole. And I hope that you've all been many times, but also in the context of the show, to the dormitories upstairs of the convent of San Marco, and have noticed that not one of the three magi is shown as the so-called king of Arabia or Africa, as typically identified as Balthazar, but there is an onlooker between two men in what look to be Ottoman and Mamluk headdresses, and a horse in the background, almost like a member of a cast of characters with really no specific role to play, except as, again, a secondary cast member. I should also mention that we know from documentary evidence that Cosimo Vecchio, who occupied this cell, the cell 39, at the very end of the north corridor of the dormitories that was set aside for the lay members of the dormitories. We know that Cosimo owned at least 4 slaves, 4 female slaves in the 1450s, just like Francesco Sassetti, who commissioned probably the next most famous chapel or chapels, along with the Tornabuoni in Florence, is known to have owned female slaves as well. And this is the detail to which I just alluded. Perhaps a bit less familiar, at least to those who haven't studied or spent all that much time in the UK, is this object. This is the so-called Paston treasure. To whom is this unfamiliar? Oh, okay, good. That was the whole point, that there will at least be something to surprise you, but also to disturb. This is by an anonymous Dutch master, and it's also, as many of you remember, I'm sure from your undergraduate, graduate classes, a quite typical vanitas still life. It's teeming with objects, however, and it really isn't just a typical garden variety vanitas image. It's a kind of virtual Wunderkammer, but it is also inhabited by 2 human beings, one of whom at the extreme left is quite easy at first to ignore. He almost serves as a tonal foil for the gray vervet monkey from East or South Africa that is perched on his shoulder. He too is part of the exotic bounty that inhabits this work, just like the nautilus shells, the lutes, the flowers, and very expensive flora and fauna. An image that no doubt is more familiar, especially to everyone from Northern Europe in this room, is an image by an artist who is the subject of a brilliant show that I just had a chance to see during the Germany Contormo tour. That is the so-called rare Proteus, as he was called by Karel van Mander, Hendrik Goltzius, who made the print at left at the close of the 16th century. It's a personification of day and night, and I don't think it really needs any explanation. It's technically a stunning visual image and a very disconcerting one iconographically, because as we see, night is represented by a female African who is cast in darkness, and Phoebus or Apollo, personifying light, is a triumphant, athletic white male, a radiant figure of light and knowledge itself. And to me, this made for a striking corollary with a still more arresting image in its disquiet, I think, to 21st century eyes, and that is an illustration to a story from the fables of Aesop, which are anything but innocent, as we all know. And it captures the phrase "to wash an Ethiopian," or to do the impossible. And that is what we see here at right. The irony here, for some of you who are especially familiar with Aesop, not just as a teller of tales, but in terms of his biography and the way that he was remembered, even in the 13th century, by a Byzantine scholar named Plunides, is that he himself was Ethiopian by birth, and Ethiopians were considered to be the most dark-skinned of sub-Saharan Africans in this period. In fact, they were deemed to be burnt by the sun, and as you may also know, the darkness of their skin was often equated with a darkness of soul. So very sinister secondary readings to their appearance. And what we see here is a late 15th century woodcut showing a misshapen, hunchbacked, pot-bellied, altogether seemingly, quote, ugly and grotesque figure of Aesop himself. And in fact, this is how he described himself, as ugly and grotesque, which might remind you also of Boccaccio's tall tales describing Giotto as being particularly uncomely, and yet being able to create the most beautiful works. And when asked how he could possibly, upon a guest arriving at dinner, create such ugly children, and yet such beautiful works, Giotto quipped, well, I create my works at night in the light, in the day. I create children in the dark. And so there's this trope of ugly authors or creators creating the most sublime works. And we see this, of course, in the canvas at right by Diego Velázquez, which is both literally and conceptually such a monumental work, but showing Aesop as no more than a mere beggar. And in thinking about the many difficult images and certainly concepts and issues involved, I was indebted in January in helping to organize the conference here at the NIKI. And in all of my thinking since then, I haven't wanted to let our experience of organizing and hosting here that conference, because again, it was, for me as a scholar, it was really life-changing, because it somehow captured a new way of doing things, a new model of scholarship that was really based not just on highly accomplished individuals presenting their material and then leaving. We've all stayed in touch, and we've all informed one another's work. And I hope that that will also emerge a bit later in tonight's presentation in various ways. But then and now, there are two publications, one of which was manifested in a very formative, I think, for many early modern scholars, exhibition at Wright. Two publications that have been especially seminal. And the first is this quite slender but very potent exhibition catalog of a show that was put on by Joni Spicer, and Kate Lowe and 2 other contributors helped shape this publication that I constantly, it sold out very quickly, but I have 1 copy for the department at NYU and 1 copy of my own, and I assign, it's very dog-eared, I constantly assign material from it to my students, because in many ways it reminded me or really directed me to a new way of thinking about the discipline and about the primacy of both social history and material culture, always framed within the context of the horrors of slavery. And this was something that served as something of a compass point. And unlike the single and, as I mentioned, quite slender publication, the one left is a 5-volume, 11-book series that continues to grow, that now, as of 2017, includes African and Asian art, the confluences between the two. And this is a series that has been edited by David Bindman and Harry Lewis Gates, or Skip Gates, from the Hutchins Center at Harvard, which is an invaluable depository of also of image archives on this subject. And for any of you from the Netherlands, of course, this is an image that is canonical in so many ways, even though the subject matter, at least when I was a student, wouldn't have been taught. And this is a painting from the House in The Hague from 1661. And I made a promise to myself: the longer I teach, and God, I can't believe it's been a quarter of a century, which is quite frightening. But I now really try to commit myself to teaching courses that I was never taught, that I did not necessarily have a chance to take as an undergraduate. And in some ways, I found myself, and this is the autobiographical part of tonight's presentation, catching up to history. Again, so much of the material that we're going to see today has encouraged me, really prompted and forced me to rethink the way that I think about how teaching is done, and how we use language to describe that which is sometimes unspeakable. And thinking about another recent exhibition, a show that I just mentioned that was in Baltimore and Princeton, revealing the African presence in Renaissance Europe, took place in 2012 and almost didn't happen until a partner was found, a willing partner in Princeton, the Princeton University Museum. And the show that I'm showing you now followed suit 8 years later, and I hope some of you saw it at Rembrandt House. How many of you had a chance to? Only one person on that. But it centered not just on Rembrandt, who, as many of you know, lived in a neighborhood, and in fact, Rembrandt House is positioned in a neighborhood that featured a very active community of now adopted local Africans. And throughout Rembrandt's career, he painted no fewer than 10 African figures and represented them in no fewer than 6 etchings and 6 drawings. And this is, of course, probably just the tip of the iceberg. This is what has survived. This is an exhibition that, as you see from the caption, was co-organized by Elmer Colfin and Stephanie Archangel. And again, during my very recent travels in Germany, I was absolutely transfixed by the portrait. It's quite a small, intimate portrait of the Black youth who remains nameless. In fact, he shares the same feathered plume that we see in the tiny, quite heartbreaking print of a bust of an African woman that is shown at left, which is exactly contemporaneous to the Dao portrait. But it again, I think, prompts the question: do we or can we recognize ourselves in these faces? But also, how do we recognize and articulate the difference? And so many of the objects that were featured in revealing the African presence in Baltimore and then Princeton engaged with virtually every part of the sensorium. They spanned every medium, but also worked on every imaginable scale, from large polychrome, almost life-size figures of Saint Benedict of Palermo, a 16th century saint, to these very intimate and highly tactile cameos, all of them from Vienna and Munich, made of precious and semi-precious materials. And there were also, I hope I did the right thing by clicking on it. There were also objects that, especially seen collectively, at first may have dazzled the eye, but then began to insinuate themselves in other ways, and of course began to disturb, because one of the recurring themes, and not just in this exhibition, but in studying this material and studying it not selectively but collectively, is the decorative exoticizing function of so many of these objects that were in part utilitarian, but were also meant to dazzle the eye and appear almost like collectibles in a Kunst der Wunderkammer. And so at left, we see an Italian sword, possibly a saber, with not one, but multiple African heads, and an almost sword-like or a female figure rising from a sheep. This highly attenuated, hyper-elegant figure of a black woman at her bath, almost appearing like a black Venus in a private collection. This is yet another kind of object, applied arts, precious object of the same kind from the Louvre, in which a Black African profile, as you can see in the detail at right, is framed quite tellingly against an idealized Ephebic youth, and this might remind you of the Hendrik Goltzius print that we saw of the division between night and day, and the moralizing, of course, messages that are inherent in that image. And then we reach images, not images really, objects such as this. And here I'm not necessarily going to show you images from any particular exhibition, but this is where we may next travel. And of course, with each object that I'm about to show you, in some ways, the disquiet only grows. And there's something perhaps quite difficult happening here, especially with the object at right. I'm showing you an ancient prototype, a Hellenistic oil lamp at left from the Brooklyn Museum in New York. And also from New York, this composite oil lamp made of various parts. And again, like the Milanese sword that I just showed you, it's an object that almost seems to produce synesthetic or multisensory effects. To me, every time I've seen this object, and it's not on display at the moment, it almost seems to wail or to howl, to produce sound. In fact, there's quite a wonderful description, in the way that I think it captures the disturbing elements of this object in the Met literature, in which we read of a chorus of silent screams. Screams plural, because if you look closely, there are multiple heads that are emerging from this oil lamp. And remember the name of the author of this object, a decorative object, a collectible object, one of sensuous pleasure if owned, producing a kind of pride of ownership, but it's produced in the workshop of an artist named Andrea Riccio, or curly-headed, and we're going to return to him quite shortly. The object or objects that I just showed couldn't be more different than this little cameo that is in fact quite blurry when you see it in person. And this was featured in the Revealing the African Presence exhibition. And just like the catalog, its power, or its message, I should say, really belies its delicate size, because running along its border in Italian is an inscription that reads, "Nature is beautiful for its variety." And as the authors of the catalog explain, I think absolutely rightly, this is not meant ironically, it's certainly not meant in jest. And again, this is an object that was meant to be worn and alternatively carried and very highly valued and cherished. And there's a quote that appears in the exhibition catalog that I would love to read because it makes for such a striking contrast to a quote that I read back in January in the context of Albrecht Dürer's Katharina, the 20-year-old African slave in a Portuguese household in Antwerp. And the quote that's quoted in the Baltimore catalog is from the essayist Michel de Montaigne. And he writes, "For a painter in the Indies, beauty is black and swarthy or sunburnt, with thick swollen lips and broad flat noses," precisely the description, along with knobby knees, this caricature description that Dürer makes in his book on proportions in 1528. But we should fashion ugliness that way as Westerners, Montaigne writes. It seems we have little knowledge of natural beauty or of beauty in general, since we humans give so much diverse forms to our own beauty. If it had been prescribed by nature, we would all hold common views about it, just as we all agree that fire is hot. So Montaigne, in fact, is admitting that his own worldview or his own understanding of beauty is highly limited. But this cameo brings me to, in some ways, the heart of tonight's talk, which is that from small beginnings, or in this case, very small objects, come big things. And some of the most remarkable of discoveries, or I think the best way to describe them is rediscoveries or recoveries, have come from micro-histories or micro-objects that allow us to interpret and better understand their holders, their wearers, their owners. And this image, I'm sure, is very familiar to many of you because it resides in the Rijksmuseum. It's, I think, one of the most remarkable portraits in that collection, if not the world. And it's Jan Mostard's portrait of an African man. And he was always described thus, quite generally, even though, as you can see, even without me describing this work or without necessarily reading the work of John Brackett or others who have written, obviously, the entire curatorial staff of the Rijksmuseum on this work, that there's an entire almost star system, constellation of clues as to who this individual might be. First and foremost, we recognize him based on the detail at left. Again, big things come from small beginnings. It's something that I've become absolutely obsessed with. I become obsessed very easily, as Michael knows, with all sorts of things, with pilgrim badges or hat pins, hat badges. And so this is monstrously large on the screen, but it's a tiny object, as of course you can see here in the portrait itself. And it represents a specific hat badge. This is an example from the British Museum showing Mary of Halle in what was then the Brabant. And it's absolutely tiny. It's one of the smaller objects that I'm showing you today, less than 40 millimeters in diameter. And it, of course, identifies this subject as Christian. And this particular church of Mary of Halle was extremely popular as a pilgrimage site, as an endpoint for visitors from the court of Brussels. And so this sitter has been identified along two different avenues as someone who was quite an important member of the court of Margaret of Austria in Mechelen, or that of her cousin Charles V in Brussels. He may be a very well-known bodyguard in the court of Charles V, as well as a highly skilled archer named Christoffel de Moor. And his name appears repeatedly in documents that deal with the retinue of the rulers of the Spanish Netherlands, for the first time as a groom in 1503, and for the last time in 1521, when he was a member of the bodyguard for Charles V's imperial coronation. But John Brackett, who taught for many years at the University of Cincinnati in the US, has in fact identified his beginnings, or at least has proposed an origin story for this noble. And he might not be a soldier, but in fact a courtier or a nobleman from Congo, or specifically Bakongo. John Thornton has traced 3 areas in this region. It would be what is close to present Angola, the lowest or the most southern of the 3 regions in this area, and it's very possible that he entered the court of Brussels, or in this other interpretation of his route to what is now Belgium and Mechelen via Portugal. And so from this hat pin as well, we can at least begin to identify his beginnings. And it also, of course, ties in with even more familiar objects that are closer to home being Florence. And that is this archer, which absolutely must be a portrait. And yet it's going to be up to all of the master's and PhD students in this room and listening online, Emma, I'm speaking to you, to help trace his origins and revive his voice. This is an archer without any arrows, and he marches in the retinue of, in this particular case, Piero de' Medici, in between Piero and on his mule, and Galeazzo Maria Sforza. And he's also believed to potentially be modeled after a real flesh and blood member of a Portuguese retinue that was in Florence, either in or before the 1450s. And perhaps, again, speaking of small beginnings, perhaps the most astonishing object that I personally have had the thrill of discovering and also teaching in my courses is this one. It has double meaning in a way for, again, other new seminars, new courses that I've developed back home on Washington Square Park, the latest one being a course called By Herself on women artists in early modern Europe, this time inspired by a small inscription on a frame of a self-portrait of Sophonies Banjasola at a harpsichord. It's a double portrait with her and her maid at Northampton in England, and the label, the permanent label, actually says By Herself. She's by herself, but of course it's painted by her own hand as well. And this small watercolor on vellum is painted by Giovanni Garzoni, who I hope some of you had a chance to discover for yourselves 5 years ago in an exhibition that was in the Palazzo Pitti. And this object was shown there and then purchased. It was acquired just a year later by the Oberlin Museum of Art, by their college museum in Ohio. And it represents Zaga Christ. How many of you have had a chance to see this extraordinary object? It's kind of Seurat before Seurat, or Signac before Signac. It's painted with the most minute, pointillist painting method. And I almost don't know where to begin in describing this work, but I think one has to describe this work or begin to describe it with the subject himself. Zaga Christ, who's thought to have emerged actually astride, I should say, a camel, coming from, as he was described, from the deserts of Ethiopia. He was the self-proclaimed king of Ethiopia. And he traveled to Italy, being received by the Pope in Rome, and ended his travels in France, where he was welcomed by none other than Cardinal Richelieu. He also, during this time, he died at the age of, if I remember correctly, 22. But he lived, he really lived a very full life and had a love affair with a nun named Francesca, with whom why isn't anyone taking notes? This is not property politique I'm talking about here, a la Browning, but he really did this. He exchanged letters of love and affection with Francesca written in blood while in France, and they actually still survive. So quite a remarkable figure who, whether he really was the rightful heir to the throne of Ethiopia or not, was acclaimed everywhere he went for his manner, for his intelligence, for his eloquence. Just an absolutely remarkable object, but also a remarkable testament, I have to say here, within the life and career of Giovanna Garzoni. As you might be able to see here, and I know there's one person in this room who may in fact even be able to perhaps read this, but the script on the back of this cameo-like object is actually written both in Italian, but also in Ethiopic. And it's written by Giovanna Garzoni, so it speaks to something of an intimate relationship perhaps between her and Zaga King when they were both in the court of Turin. That's when this astonishing object was created. And it's a very, I think it's clear, very sympathetic and highly, highly individualized portrayal of Zaga King, of Zaga Christ, I'm sorry. He's always described in the literature as Christ in shorthand, which makes things quite confusing. But this was commissioned perhaps as a gift, in other words, commissioned by Zaga Christ from Giovanna to give to the court, to send to the court of France, or perhaps it was something commissioned by the Duke of Savoy in Turin, and then in fact gifted to Zaga Christ himself. And as I have recently learned, there's a book on Zaga Christ, which I'm sure will feature this object, that is in the works by Matteo Salvadore, who's professor of history at American University in Sharjah, whose first book I certainly remember was on the African Christian king of Ethiopia, Prester John. So he's now at work on this subject, and I cannot wait to see the fruits of his labors. And so now, by way of all of these case studies, to return to Katerina and her story, and perhaps as I imagine her refusal to belong during what must have been an excruciatingly uncomfortable sitting for Dürer in the year 1521. I've returned to the silver point drawing so many times at the Gabinetto dei Disegni, including during this stay as a scholar in residence at Ilaria. My colleague there now refers to Caterina as my innamorata. And it's really not all that far from the truth. And so in this attempt to perform the task of recovery, this very imperfect task of recovery that also at times in the case of Zaga Christ, certainly in the case of the Congo nobleman, does admittedly run the risk of exceptionalism, because we seem to be selecting quite extraordinary personages on whom to focus instead of the maids and the grooms and the sailors and the pages and shop boys that populate so many paintings and prints of this period, almost always on the margins. It has to be said that certain works are indeed exceptional and call for particular attention that then I think informs us and sets us out on new directions in which to strike out in search of answers about identities that still remain either concealed, misunderstood, or largely ignored. And in this particular sense, there's really been no occasion in this particular case, yet another exhibition, that has really transformed my own way of thinking or my own method in asking these difficult questions. And that is the show Posing Modernity that didn't happen all that long ago But it was an exhibition that closed pre-COVID, but to me is as fresh and as vital as if I remember it from just a month ago. And in fact, I was there at the opening, and I remember the feeling that I had that I'm encountering a new kind of art history. And this show, just like revealing the African presence, as Joni Spicer confided to me, almost didn't happen until the Ford Foundation stepped in and supported Denise Murrell's efforts to mount this show, which ended up not only happening at the Wallach Art Gallery, the Columbia University Art Gallery, but it made such an impact, such a seismic impact on not just the New York artistic and student community, but the global community, that the Louvre, that didn't lend the most, in some ways, seminal work for this exhibition, Edouard Manet's Olympia, then staged their own show that was curated not by one, not by two, but by four curators, the entire team of the Musée d'Orsay. And I'm about to let you in on another autobiographical fact, because I remember also as if it was yesterday. Again, it's hard to believe I've been teaching for 25 years, because I actually remember all of my experience as an undergraduate. So I remember reading T.J. Clarke's chapter on Olympia's Choice in his book on the painting of modern life, and I will get to that in a second. But Denise Murrell's exhibition completely reoriented the way that I think many of us, and Darcy Grigsby's work, of course, before her, and Lorraine O'Grady's work before her, reoriented our way of thinking about not just makers, not just about authors, but also about models. In this particular case, Black female models. Because thanks to their collective efforts, we now know the Black maid to not just be a Black maid, or as she was titled in this painting at right in Turin, La Négresse, but a woman with a name and a life and a place. Her name was Laure. And one of my favorite parts of the show came at the very, very beginning. Olympia itself was represented by a facsimile. I believe it was the second gallery. And in a moment of disclosure, I have to say my mother, who's by far the most talented member of the Geronimus family, did the graphic design for this exhibition. So I remember this vividly as well, because she really toiled with the curatorial and exhibition team for many nights, making this remarkable map that really orients you in not just the world, but the daily lives of Edouard Manet, his family, his contemporaries, his entire artistic network, but also of Laure herself. And so they lived at 25 to 30-minute walk away. And I'm sorry to leave my station for all of you looking online, but just to point out, B3 in the 12th arrondissement is the studio belonging to Edouard Manet, and A1, kind of the epicenter of this map, is or was the home of Laure on Rue de Ventimille, number 11. And so I know Denise Murrell timed it, I timed it as well. It was less than a half-hour walk. They knew each other, they worked with each other, as you can see in this painting in Turin. Edouard Manet also used her as a model for other works. So Olympia is not only being performed by Victorine Merunt, but it's a duet with Victorine and Laure. And this is the autobiographical bit. I remember distinctly having a handout, the kinds of handouts that would leave ink on Emma's lucky enough to have come long after. Now you have beautiful digital copies, but it stained one's hands when you went through all of the photocopies. And this is how I saw Laure. She was virtually indistinguishable from the black cat that springs up on on the bedclothes here in Allard. In other words, as a 18, 19-year-old reader, viewer, this was my initial experience of an otherwise brilliant essay in the painting of modern life. But I think one of the other things to consider, and this of course goes for everything from Donatello's David to many of the images to Paris Bourdon's Night with a Page at the Metropolitan Museum, that also in previous publications many, many years ago made it very difficult to distinguish the features of the young black page at right. How important reproductions, images really are for those who haven't seen works in the flesh to understanding their full power. And you know, one of the questions that of course arises from everything that we've seen thus far and where we've traveled up to this point also introduces the question of not just the subject, but of course the maker. And this was a dialogue, speaking of my mother. I was trying to convince her, without giving away the subject of tonight's talk, that she hasn't yet seen what she believes doesn't altogether exist outside of the sphere of literature, and not just Alexander Dumas, but of course Alexander Pushkin, but makers of objects and images that are of Black African descent. And we do have examples of this, even though some of it is conjectural, some of it is speculative, but the clues, again, are there. And it's up to us and up to so many of the students in this audience, this is why this whole talk is dedicated to you, to continue looking and continue asking the difficult questions and continue excavating the archives for new clues and new tesserae of evidence. The third example I'm about to show you is by far the most celebrated, but two that might not be quite as familiar to you, that were also introduced or reintroduced to the public in revealing the African presence, are these two figures. The first we've encountered already in the highly disturbing oil lamp, one of so many that he had conceived, and this is the so-called curly-headed artist Andrea Riccio, who worked in a really heady atmosphere of Padua, as you know, a university city, and produced absolutely phenomenal works that were inspired by antiquity, but always had his stamp of not just naturalism, but as we're about to see, hypernaturalism, even when he was showing not just creatures from the natural world, but hybrid human beasts that do not exist in any natural habitat and only can be conceived in his imagination. And this painter named Francesco Torbido, that can be interpreted as kind of veiled or cloudy, whose father was named Marco India, and as the catalog and the exhibition in Baltimore and Princeton explained, India was often in fact confused with Ethiopia. So it's Francesco the Cloudy, this Marco, son of Marco of India, and his nickname, in fact, as it appears on two occasions in the life of Carotto and in his own biography in Vasari's Vitae, mentions him as Il Moro. And I'm about to show you objects by both of these artists. I think the one by Riccio is going to be more familiar to you. And I could have chosen so many, but in the interest of time, I chose one as a scholar in Piero di Cosimo that I absolutely couldn't resist, even though I'm now working on Fontormo. Piero is never far behind, and he in fact was a one-time mentor of Fontormo. But this is just an astonishingly beautiful, but also, unlike the oil lamp I showed you that really applies in stereotypes, is extremely sensitive because it and empathic. It represents two bestial creatures of ancient myth canoodling. They're actually in a loving embrace, and if I was to really zoom in on their faces, the male satyr has these kind of hairy, bushy eyebrows, and the satiress has plucked her eyebrows, and she's looking particularly elegant. You can barely see them. It's a loving embrace, not one of two intemperate beasts, but two really lovely woodland creatures. And there's so many other examples of both animals from the natural world and creatures that are completely invented. And so he really kind of transmogrifies the ancient world in his own very intellectual way. And then harder to trace are the works of Francesco Torbido. There's in fact one in a university collection that belongs to the Kress collection in Kentucky. But one of my favorite works by him is this Holy Family in the Rijksmuseum. So I hope if any of the works from Amsterdam that you've seen today are unfamiliar to you, you're now all the more eager and excited to return and look for these hidden gems. And not so hidden is this gem. And both the artists, and I hope now after the Metropolitan Museum exhibition of just 2023, the subject, the sitter, are entirely familiar to you. This is, of course, Diego Velázquez's Juan de Pareja that was painted. It's hard to believe, and I always stress this to my students, and they don't seem all that impressed when I really reiterate this, that this was a practice run, that this was a dry run for Velázquez painting Pope Innocent X, when Antonio Palomino, a court painter in his own right, writing in 1724, referred to the exhibition in Rome that was taking place at the Pantheon. He wrote that this painting was, quote, generally applauded by all the painters from different countries, who said that the other pictures in the show were art, but this one alone was la verdad, was truth. But it also revealed so many truths, not just about Diego Velázquez as a painter, but also now that we know so much more based on the documentary evidence about Juan de Pareja, it tells us so much about him. In the very same year that this was painted at the age of 44, he earned his freedom, his independence. And the deed, in fact, stipulated that he could now work as an independent artist 4 years later. And that he did, and produced quite a few portraits. The major portraits were featured in the Met exhibition, including this one, which is my own personal favorite, of Agustín Moreto, a famous playwright. It's now in Madrid. And this quite striking portrait that, as you can imagine, didn't make the exhibition from St. Petersburg of a monk. And this monumental canvas that anchored the show at the Met, it's huge in scale and conception, that features none other than Juan de Pareja in a self-portrait at the extreme left, really announcing his not just arrival, but his ascent. And so he, we heard a wonderful talk by Giovanna in the back about workshop practice. He himself began running his own workshop. And there are quite a few works, in fact, that may have both hands involved. And so of all the examples, of course, I could ever show you the most obvious one, but also in some ways the most spectacular one in terms of life trajectory, but also career trajectory, is that of a man born into slavery in Antequera near Malaga, who rose to produce something like this, that's now in the Prado. And one of the, if I may, one of the last really pressing questions I think that needs to be asked, and this was part of an ongoing conversation that I've been having with Vera Simone Schultz, a dear friend of mine, whom I'd never met before our conference in January, but again, this community brought us all together, about the quandary of naming. What's in a name? It's very tempting to ask the question, as I have out of my own curiosity, do we have examples of African artists in the same or roughly the same period who produced works that we can attribute to them directly? And on the face of it, it might seem like a fairly interesting question. And it's a quite natural question, I think, for a European or an American scholar or museum visitor to ask. But it sets up all sorts of needless conflicts because it imposes, of course, our desire for something being autographed and something being by a particular master that can be attributed to them. You know, something that wasn't blessed by the Rembrandt project has, I'm sure, languished in many a collection storage facilities because it's by Willem Drost or his assistant and not by Rembrandt himself. And you know, if I think those of us who work on the Renaissance, or just speaking for myself, and I'm sure Vera, certainly, if we hear the term Lotto carpet or Holbein carpet one more time, not a carpet that was actually, you know, produced in Anatolia or elsewhere, we're all going to scream. And so it sets up a kind of you know, false binary, especially for places in which production was communal and functioned in completely different ways. So I couldn't resist showing you two objects. In fact, coming from Congo, and here I have to cite Alyssa Lagama's just inexpressibly beautiful and meaningful show, Congo Power and Majesty, from exactly 10 years ago, that I also feel like happened a year ago. Made by Congo artists, and this is actually a region of Africa for which we do have names, several names of early modern metalsmiths working in this region. But again, a highly problematic exercise that I think we would certainly be best to avoid, and I think we'd be best served to just admire as Alyssa's title mentioned, the power and majesty of, in this case, these otherwise fairly small, intimate objects like this crucifix from the 16th and 17th or 17th century, and one of my favorite works in all of the Met, this pendant showing St. Anthony of Padua that is quite difficult to date, but ranges from the 16th to the 19th centuries. Certain other discoveries are both almost miraculous, and once we do the work and discover the identity and biography and life story of the figure, all the more heartbreaking for it. And I wanted to, I have a few more images, but I think probably running out of time. Perhaps this is an apt place to end. I also wanted to speak a bit about textiles. But this is, of course, not an early modern work, but a portrait by Gustav Klimt that was just shown. So this is very recent at TEFAF in Maastricht this spring by a Viennese gallery. And it was identified by Alfred Weidinger, who's an authority on Klimt. And we now know the identity of this remarkable portrait. It is a portrait. And it is that of the West African Prince William Yi Norte Duana, who is a member of the Ga people. It dates exactly to the year that Klimt co-founded the Vienna secession movement. So one could say aesthetically, artistically, that it's part of a vanguard, the very beginning of a vanguard movement within the career of Klimt. But it also captures a much more sinister European colonial history. As the subject of this painting, even though, as we can see here, a West African prince was recruited to participate in what were called Volkerschau, or human shows in Venice, exploitative showcases that were equated with human zoos that were very popular all across Europe in the 19th century. And as you can well imagine, drawing on all sorts of ethnic stereotypes. And Weidinger, again, the world authority on Klimt, told the Washington Post that according to the records, Prince William and 120 other members of the Osu people, the tribe that took part in these so-called guest performances in Vienna between just several months of 1897, were displayed in front of 5,000 to 10,000 people daily as human specimens. And so everything I think that we've seen today, and there's so many other, in many ways at once seemingly beautiful but heartbreaking images that take us back to Florence and Fra Angelico, that I would love to show you, but I know that I think I've gone over time. This is a whole series of tales, of stories, networks of stories that really do deserve a life of their own. This is from Jacobus de Voragine's Golden Legend from the 13th century. So it's an old and yet to this day harrowing tale of the so-called miracle of the Black Leg that Scott Nethersole, who also participated in our conference in January, has written on powerfully. It's a predella panel at the extreme right of the San Marco altarpiece, which is, is one of the centerpieces of Beato Angelico's career and the dual exhibition here. But it shows the story of a Roman deacon named Justinian, who has a cancerous or gangrenous leg, is going to either die or lose his leg, and prays to the objects of his chief devotion, the twin saints of Cosmas and Damian, who of course are the patron saints of the Medici, to heal him. And under the cover of night, they do so. And this is perhaps the most graphic representation of what transpires next, because it actually shows not just the mutilation of a Black African, but the grave robbing that's taking place in this other predella by Sandro Di Pietro, a Sienese artist. And the leg is transplanted onto that of Justinian, and he is saved. And I'm sorry to end on such an image of violence, but to me, the most heartbreaking representation of this tale actually lives on in Baldwin. And it shows the Black Ethiopian is still alive. And as you can see here again, almost like Radicchio oil lamp howling in pain. And so, again, this theme of bodies, this is the image from the title slide by Melchior Barthel, asks so many questions of us in terms of what we see and how we not only interpret these four atlases, which upon closer viewing, looking at their bedraggled clothing, are clearly captives. So these caryatids are slaves holding up the tomb of Pesaro. But then how do we find the language to reconcile these kinds of objects with another work by the very same artist, just as we saw with Andrea Riccio. And this is a bust by Melchior Barthel that you can see now in St. Louis, which is completely individualized, completely sympathetic, and made at exactly the same time as he's working on the Pesaro tomb in Venice. So I will end there with a question rather than a neat and tidy conclusion. And I'm sorry that I ran on for so long, but I've been thinking about this for quite some time, ever since our conference in January. And I hope that we can make this an open and ended dialogue rather than your conventional lecture. Any comments and questions are most welcome.